Okay, Paul, go ahead and unmute. We're ready.
Okay, we should have share screen. Oh, I think I've got the screen shared.
Yeah, we got it up. It says you're sharing. It's a black screen right now.
Well,
There you go. Devil's Tower.
all right. I should have the picture of Richard Hawk first.
Yes, you do.
I put the picture of Richard Hawk up because news from Earl yesterday that Richard had passed to the next chapter. And the fact that Richard and Othello spoke to us twice on the forum. He presented a year ago in October on civil rights in the Book of Mormon. And then he shared his personal account as a African-American, in largely living in a white man's society. And he encouraged us to build on our commonalities, because if we can focus on our commonalities rather than our differences, we can learn to live together much more amicably. He served as president of the 70 for the Christ and retired there, but continued his ministry in many camps and reunions and as an online ministry or resource. His wife continues to work at Michigan State University as the director of placement services, helping people find their place in the world. Their last presentation last summer was on the hand of God in the Book of Mormon and today. And you may remember that they sang to us. With his passing to the world of immortality yesterday, we thank God for the blessings of his life and pray for the eternal care of his family. The human race has been blessed by this good human, and we have been blessed by his presence with us. We'll pause just for a moment and invite you to reflect the blessings of people like Richard Hawks. All right, welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum this evening. Again, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you that are the faithful returning people that keep coming back Monday after Monday to, well, and some of you have been doing it with us for more than 2 years now. And I thank you for that, because I appreciate that it expresses the interest that we have across the spectrum of Mormonism and beyond in the nature of the sacred book. We've been dealing with this series that started with Joseph Smith III's press conference, looking at the question that raises in the first part of the Book of Mormon, where where Nephi indicates that he was blessed with goodly, and they taught him in the mystery. And so the question then is, what are the mysteries of God that we need to be passing on to our children? And so we've had Joseph III addressing the mysteries of God as seen in the transformative process of his life. We've had the mysteries of God presented by Sterling Barlow, showing the conjunction between music. Last week we had Whitney Hornig pointing God as they apply to developing expertise. And this evening, Jonathan Neville is going to be addressing us on being reasonable, rational. Well, how is the request that comes from the book of Isaiah to come, let us reason together? How is that tied to these mysteries of God? And so, as we share together, we anticipate that we can reason together and allow the Spirit of truth to bless us. And we want to welcome Brother Neville and his wife back, because I saw that she was on another of the screens, and I'm delighted to do that, to welcome them both. Let me kick that. Let us pray together. creator of an integrated, rational multiverse. We seek our place, our contribution to understand you every season. For we recognize your presence in the galaxies, in our Milky Way, in our new year, in our deepest feelings, and in our best ability to reason. The adaptations of life through bacteria, viruses, a multitude of species, shows us your creative genius. And then we hear your voice, your prophets, your son who came and lived and died and was resurrected to redeem us. And we are hard pressed to comprehend, to even begin to apprehend how our mortality can be important to you. Yet, although it is beyond our grasp, recognition of your love reassures us our immortality is true. Perhaps it is desire for mortals, even as we desire for immortality, providing balance between physical and spiritual needs in the universe, designed by your rationality. Perhaps the spectrum of reason is like the waves of sound and water and history and light, wherein our capabilities are but a snapshot of your might. Awesome might. Perhaps rationale is relational, developing bridges by which we can connect, guided by our best thinking and your spirit nudging us toward gratitude and divine respect. Whatever your intent, your plan we so limitedly understand, we ask thee, blessed Brother Neville, our presenter, to help us focus upon the reason mystery from your hand. And in the cool of winter in which we anticipate the renewing season, we pray for your spirit to bless us as we attempt a practicum in good reason. In the name of Jesus, exemplar of kindness, love, encouraging Zionic cohesion. Amen. Brother Neville, Book of Mormon Forum is yours for a presentation tonight, and welcome back. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me again. I love this forum. I kind of feel out here in Oregon that we're away from all you guys in the Midwest. It's been a while since we've been out to that area, but we're loving it out here anyway. So before I go ahead.
Let me intrude with one more personal point, because Earl Watt has put a picture of Joel and Enid DeBarth, my parents, behind him.
Oh, nice.
That would be a picture taken, he says, at Thanksgiving, when my parents and his parents were some good friends. They shared Thanksgiving together in about the year 2000. And then both his parents and my parents passed by 2007. And so the fact that our families go back a long ways, and Harry has done me the honor with that photo means I wouldn't call it to your attention, because wow, we are so blessed. When we look back at the shoulders of those that have provided us the history that we can stand upon. Now, excuse my interruption.
No, I love that. That was a wonderful interruption. I had mentioned to Paul that I'm an artist too, and so you can see I'm in my studio here. And I told him that I might show a couple of paintings that I'm working on, because this year, of course, is the 200th anniversary of Moroni's first visit to Joseph Smith. And so I did a study of a Hill Cumorah scene that it's not as far from complete, and I'll probably redo it anyway, but I'll just show you to give you an idea of some of the things I'm working on. Most of what I do are ocean themed things, but this is based on the topography of the Hill Cumorah, New York. I don't know if you can see that very well, but I've got Mormon and Moroni on the hill here, anticipating the Lamanites coming over it. when I did an in-depth study, I may have told you before that we used to have a house out in Palmyra. We lived out there and I spent a lot of time in the area. And there's actually a remnant of a fortification in this valley that you can still see. It's on the topographical maps. When Heber C. Kimball joined the church, he went out to the Hill Cumorah here. He lived in the area, and he said he could still see the embankments around the hill. I know a lot of people think that the Hill Cumorah, New York, is not the site of the battles of the Jaredites and the Nephites. I do think that, but I'm doing some paintings in that area of some of these early events that haven't been painted before, as far as I've been able to tell, and that's just one of them. Okay, so let's. I'll share my screen here. We like PowerPoints because they help us depict what's happening. Is it sharing? Is it sharing the presentation now? Yeah, it is. Okay. So this, of course, is the home where Joseph and Emma lived when Joseph translated the abridged plates. He translated the original plates in Nephi up in Fayette, but he translated all of the abridged plates here in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And this is a recreation of the house as it was when they lived here. It's at the Priesthood Restoration site. I don't know how many of you have been able to go out there, but it's an awesome place. So the idea of this, the rational restoration, is the title of a book that I'm releasing soon. And the whole idea is that the restoration improves our perspectives on reality. And this is a comparison between the Hubble and the Webb telescopes. And you can go to this link if you're interested, and you can scroll back and forth between images of the two telescopes and see how much greater the resolution is from the Webb telescope, because of the improved technology and some of the different ways that they look into space, basically. But it's been really amazing to see. We used to think the Hubble telescope was fantastic, and it really is. But the Webb telescope is showing us things that we had no idea existed in terms of the number of galaxies and the distances and so on. And that's kind of how I see the restoration, as giving us improved perspectives on reality. Now, of course, mortality can be confusing. This is a picture we took a couple of months ago. We were in Chamonix, France, and they had this this kind of diagram of all the tallest mountains around the world and how far they were away from Chamonix. It has the tallest mountain in Antarctica, Mount Vincent, and so on. But it just shows you the complexity of the Earth and how there's all these different signs that we face in our lives, pointing us in different directions. And I wanted to relate something here. I have this saying that I say often now, and that is that the hardest thing about mortality is how real it seems. And that's because it was about 40 years ago. I don't know if I've told this group this story before, but I was a criminal defense lawyer at the time. And one of my clients kind of went a little nuts. And I had worked out kind of a plea bargain for him, but he'd been threatened by his co-conspirators. And so he came up with the idea that he was going to kill me and then kill himself to solve all his problems. So he came in my office and we were talking, and he was pacing around me, and he had a knife attached to his sleeve that he ripped out, and he stabbed me in my upper back and knocked me over on the floor, and he was trying to strangle me and stuff. And during that, there was just in mortality, it would have been maybe 2 seconds. But I had that near-death experience that you always hear about, where your whole life flashes in front of you. And it's impossible to describe. You know, you really do feel like you're in a completely different dimension, and you see a different kind of window into a different type of life, I guess you could say, that's beyond mortality when you go through that near-death experience. And ever since then, really for the last 40 years, I've been very interested in figuring out this thing I say about the hardest thing about mortality is how real it seems. We really are, you know, as they say, spiritual beings have a mortal experience. But for me, that's a very real thing because of this near-death experience I had. And so I see the restoration as helping me understand that a lot. And one of the ways it does is by reframing narratives. Today, there was a Dilbert cartoon that it's kind of it's a joke, but it gives you an idea of how we can reframe narratives. And I'll just read it in case you can't see it. The boss says, I have some good news. I'm giving you a 4% raise. And Dilbert says, inflation is at 7%. So really that's a 3% pay cut in effect. So he reframed it as a pay cut, but it was a raise. Then the boss goes and says, he keeps adding context to my lies of omission. Is that grounds for firing him? And the human resource guy says, yes. But I like that cartoon because it shows how a single fact can have two interpretations, right? The boss says he's giving him a raise, and he says, well, you're increasing my pay, but it's really a pay cut because of inflation. And the idea of adding context to his lies of omission, that's what we want to do often, is add context. One of the most powerful reframes that I know of in the scriptures was when Joseph Smith was in the Liberty Jail. And the Lord told him all these things that had happened to him. But at the very end, he said, know thou, my son, that all these things shall give thee experience and shall be for thy good. That is a complete reframe of how many people view mortality. So many of us feel burdened by the problems that we have, or the disabilities, or the pressures, all these different things that impede our progress. And a lot of people ask me, because when this guy stabbed me, his knife went into my spine, and the doctors all said it was a miracle that it didn't sever my spinal cord, because the knife hit my spinal cord and really caused me to lose all feeling from my waist down for a while. And then my leg was disabled really for about 20 years. And so, but I really took this passage to heart, because it really did give me experience, and it was for my good. It gave me a much greater appreciation for the health that I had taken for granted, and for difficulties that other people have. I became much more empathetic because I experienced it myself. And so that's one of my favorite reframes in all the scriptures. Well, this book that we're releasing, called The Rational Restoration, has about 50 reframes in it. I'll give you an example of a couple of them tonight if we have time. But I have a discussion of rationality and religion, and I'm trying to make sense of the past, present, and future of the restoration. So here's one example of one of the reframes, reframing the restoration itself. The old narratives from the faithful side have been that the restoration kind of came out of nowhere to thwart traditional Christianity, that their doctrines or their precepts were an abomination and all that. On the critical narrative was that the restoration was a product of Joseph Smith's imagination. So those have been old narratives that we've heard, from many sources. The reframe that I like to look at it is that the restoration fulfills the long-held aspirations of Christians everywhere. And that feeds into the idea that Jonathan Edwards was influential with Joseph Smith, that really Edwards was anticipating, not really predicting, but he was anticipating the restoration. And he said that it would come about in the New England area, and that it was going to expand throughout the world. All the things that have actually been happening, Jonathan Edwards anticipated, as did other Christians, but he articulated it so well. And so I see the Book of Mormon as really part of traditional Christian expectations, hopes, and dreams, and even Christian literature. And so I think that idea is gaining more acceptance among Christians generally, which I think is awesome, because really the Book of Mormon is God's gift for the entire world. It's not just for those who have joined a Reformation or a Restoration church. It's for everybody. I've done some work on the Book of Mormon for Muslims and for Hindus and for everybody in the world, really. And that's why I'm trying to reframe the restoration. Okay, so the basic ideas of this book, there's three basic principles. One is that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery told the truth about the restoration of the gospel. The second, that what they taught makes sense. And you see here, I have two different book covers. We haven't settled on a book cover. These are some ideas that we're working with the publisher on. So what they taught makes sense. And what they taught is corroborated by external evidence. And that's kind of where the rational part comes into this. But there's another aspect of this rational restoration that I've been thinking about, not puzzling so much, but thinking about for a long time. And that is that the religions in the world are all fairly regional. They're not based on a rational analysis, or else everybody would have the same conclusion, right? And so, and the Book of Mormon tells us that just because we have a Bible, we shouldn't suppose that it contains all of his words, right? He said, the Lord said, I command all men, both in the east and the west, the north and the south, and the islands of the sea, they shall write the words which I speak unto them. For out of the books which shall be written, I will judge the world, every man according to their works. So all these religions, according as I interpret the Book of Mormon anyway, are based on God's inspiration in different ways. And so, and yet the purpose of the Book of Mormon is for the convincing of everyone that Jesus is the Christ. So how do we accomplish that? One of the challenges that we face was expressed by Robert Heinlein. Oh, by the way, I use this map because it actually shows Mormonism on here as a separate religion. Most of these world maps of religions show don't mention Mormonism. They just show Christianity as Catholic, or Eastern Orthodox, or Protestant. This one actually showed Mormonism here. It might be hard to see, but this little area in the Intermountain area, which I thought was kind of interesting. But and you know, I've lived in Africa and China, and I've traveled a lot in India and other countries where I've been involved with these other religions and talking to people about it and understanding their perspectives. And it's very interesting that there is much in common with all the religions, but there's also major differences. In particular, there was one in India. I didn't think to put a slide in about it at Akshardham, which is outside of New Delhi. And they have, it looks like, well, there's a big temple in the middle, but they have visitor centers all around it. As we were walking through the visitor center, there was a diorama of God in a human form appearing to this man. And it looked like all the images and dioramas you see of the first vision, with the exception that God was only one person and they were wearing Indian apparel, you know, the not Western apparel. And I asked my host, I said, well, what is this? And he said that it was around 1820, God appeared to this Swami, they call him a Swami, in India. And it's a sect of Hinduism that continues today. So that's another example of this fulfillment of what the Book of Mormon teaches us, that God commands all of these people. But how do we convince the world? The purpose of the Book of Mormon is convincing the world Jesus is Christ. How do we do that in the face of all these religions? So something Robert Heinlein wrote that kind of stuck with me. This is from a short book he wrote called Revolt in 2100. But he said, you can sway 1,000 men by appealing to their prejudices quicker than you can convince one man by logic. It doesn't have to be a prejudice about an important matter either. And that is such a good depiction of human nature, isn't it? And so it's a challenge for us if the idea is we want to bring the gospel to the whole world, and yet people are more convinced by appealing to their prejudice than they are by logic. How do we do that? Well, one guy that tried to make a logical approach was Blaise Pascal, and he had this famous Pascal's wager. I talk about this in the book a little bit. And the idea is that a rational person would live as though God exists because of the infinite gain of heaven that ensues, versus the finite or temporary losses of wealth and pleasure, etc., if God does not exist. And those who wager against God's existence risk infinite loss versus only finite gains of wealth and pleasure. And he made this little matrix you can see here. So from a purely rational basis, it makes sense to live as if God exists by, keeping the commandments and so on, just looking at it this way. Now, there's been criticisms of this, of course, but this was kind of a rational basis approach to religion. And, it does kind of make sense if you follow the logic of it. He was a mathematician and he thought this was a logical way to explain why belief in God is rational. Now, another one who talked about this was Jonathan Edwards. I'll just read kind of what he said here. Reason shows that 'tis very fit and requisite that the intelligent, rational beings of the world should know something of God's scheme and design in his works, for they doubtless are the beings that are principally concerned in it. The thing that is God's great design in his works is doubtless something concerning his reasonable creatures rather than the brute beasts and lifeless things. In other words, God's great design in all of his work is aimed at us, the rational beings, intelligent, rational beings. And then he said, how can they see God's glory in his works if they don't know what God's design in them is and what he aims at by what he is doing in the world? I think that's a really profound statement, because people don't, well, in a secular society like our society is becoming more and more of, they don't find God's glory in his works. And the reason is they don't know his purpose. They don't know why he created all this. And they also don't understand, as Edward said here, what God aims at by what he is doing in the world. What is God doing in the world and why is he doing it, in other words? So the question is, why did God create the world and why is he doing what he's doing? And I think the rational restoration helps explain all that. Now, another interesting thing to think about in terms of church history is that after the first Great Awakening that Jonathan Edwards was part of, this Age of Reason kind of took over. And Thomas Paine published his book, The Age of Reason, in 1794. And the book was pretty widely published and widely distributed. It questioned the legitimacy of the Bible and Christianity generally, but it provoked a backlash back then, which contributed to the Second Great Awakening. In fact, it's interesting here to consider how Harvard has changed, because back in the day, Harvard students received a copy of a book that rebutted the Age of Reason. Harvard was very much a divinity school back then. But this contest between rationality and religion continues to this day. And yet I think the rational restoration relies on rationality, and reasoning plays a significant role in the Latter-day Scriptures, as we'll see here in a minute. For example, on March 7th, 1831, Joseph Smith contemplated a challenge he was facing, and I hope you can read it, but I'll read it in case you can't. In his history here, it says, at this age of the church, many false reports, lies, and foolish stories were published in the newspapers and circulated in every direction to prevent people from investigating the work or embracing the faith. A great earthquake in China, which destroyed from 1 to 200,000 inhabitants, was burlesqued in some papers as Mormonism in China. You can imagine that. But to the joy of the saints who had to struggle against everything that prejudice and wickedness could invent, I received the following. And then he received what is LDS section 45 that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But, in our day, of course, there's lots of opposition to the church. On my Twitter feed, often the Book of Mormon is trending because there's a lot of commentary about the Book of Mormon going on right now. And it's interesting to see. So far, I haven't seen anything blaming earthquakes as Mormonism, but Joseph Smith had to face that as an example of the opposition he had to face. So I was interested in the use of the word reason in the scriptures. Rationality or rational is not a scriptural term, but reason is. And we don't need to read through all these, but I just wanted to point out that reason is used as both a noun and a verb in the scriptures. And then I break it out here by Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, for a great price. And then, but I want to focus primarily on the verb aspect of it. Well, just in passing, let me back up here. So you can see the Book of Mormon use of the word reason is different than it is in the Bible for most of them. There's 5 that are the same, but all the rest of these, the other 13 are non-biblical uses of the word reason. And out of those, most of them are also found in the works of Jonathan Edwards. It's the kind of terminology that Joseph was using when he translated and when he received revelations. Okay, anyway. So reason as a verb in the scriptures is very interesting, because in the Bible, there's really only one passage that talks about reasoning with God, and that's the one from Isaiah. The rest of them, where Isaiah said, let us reason together. The Book of Mormon doesn't talk about reasoning with God, but there's several sections of the Doctrine and Covenants that do. One invoking Isaiah, another says, let us reason even as a man. And let's look at some of those now. And Paul gave me one from the Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants that we'll talk about also. The first one, this is the section of 45 that Joseph received when he was reading these newspaper accounts about earthquakes in China being Mormonism in China. Well, here the Lord said, wherefore come ye unto it, and with him that cometh I will reason as with men in days of old, and I will show unto you my strong reasoning. Wherefore hearken, and I will reason with you, and I will speak unto you and prophesy as unto men in days of old. Then in another one, now come, saith the Lord by the Spirit, unto the elders of this church, and let us reason together that you may understand. Let us reason, even as a man reasoneth one with another face to face. Now when a man reasoneth, he is understood of man, because he reasoneth as a man. Even so will I, the Lord, reason with you that you may understand. So I love this, because so often in doctrinal discussions or even in church history, we kind of end up, we hit these kind of roadblocks or these places where things don't seem to make sense, and we can't resolve issues in church history, or we're unsure about how to interpret a doctrine. And yet the Lord is telling us we should reason these things out, and we can reason with him and with one another, which is one of the things I love on this forum that Paul's put together, that we reason with one another, just like this. Well, here's one from D&C 162.5. And it says, do not be defined by the things that separate you, but by the things that unite you in Jesus Christ. Over and over again, you have been counseled to be reconciled, to seek the unity that is imperative to the building of the kingdom. Again, the Spirit counsels the church to not allow the forces of division to divert you from your witness. Listen together one to one another, without judgment or predisposition. Do not assume that the answers to matters of conflict have yet been perceived. There is much labor to be done. Reason together in love, and the Spirit of truth will prevail. So that's kind of my appeal as well, is in this book about the rational restoration. Part of being rational is reasoning together. And so we'll talk more about that here, but I came across an interesting discourse of Joseph Smith that is fairly obscure, because it was when he was visiting Washington, D.C. in February of 1840. And the only account we have of it is a letter that someone who was there wrote to his wife. And he summarized this sermon. This is at the end, he wrote this: there was much in his precepts, meaning Joseph Smith's precepts, if they were followed, that would soften the asperities of man towards man, and that would tend to make him a more rational being than he is generally found to be. There is no violence, no fury, no denunciation. His religion appears to be the religion of meekness, lowliness, and mild persuasion. So I love this, because here is a person who he didn't know anything about Joseph Smith. He just happened to hear him give this sermon. But he said that his precepts would make a man a more rational being than he is generally found to be. And I hope that's something that we all strive to be through the gospel. Sometimes we don't think of being more rational as being part of the gospel, but it is. And Joseph was trying to persuade people that the gospel makes us more rational. Now, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this sermon to see how this guy reported it. I believe, said he, now said he means said Joseph Smith, he was recording Joseph's sermon. I believe that there is a God possessing all the attributes ascribed to him by Christians of all denominations, that he reigns over all things in heaven and on earth, and that all are subject to his power. He then spoke rationally of the attributes of divinity, such as foreknowledge, mercy, etc. He then took up the Bible. I believe, said he, in this sacred volume. In it, the Mormon faith is to be found. We teach nothing but what the Bible teaches. We believe nothing but what is to be found in this book. So that was this individual's take of Joseph Smith's sermon, which I thought is just fascinating on a lot of levels. And there's even more to it that we could discuss about what Joseph taught. But I love these two aspects of it, that he spoke rationally about the attributes of divinity. And just to go back to that, to emphasize it, this guy took the message that the precepts that Joseph taught would make us more rational beings. Okay, so those are both cool points. Now, along these lines, getting back to Jonathan Edwards, he said, it is fit that mankind should be informed something of God's design and the government of the world, because he is made capable of actively falling in with that design and promoting it. In other words, once we know what God's purpose is or his design, then we can fall in with it, we can become part of it and promote it, and acting herein as his friends and subjects, the friends and subjects of God. It is therefore reasonable to suppose that God has given mankind some revelation to inform him of this, but there is nothing else that does it but the Bible. Of course, he lived in the 1700s. He didn't know about the Book of Mormon. By the way, all these, when I write the Jonathan Edwards stuff, anything that's in gold is non-biblical Book of Mormon language. Here we have, and Edwards continued, here we have a most rational, excellent account of this matter, worthy of God and exceedingly showing forth the glory of his perfections, meaning in the Bible. Here we are shown the connection of the various parts of the work of providence, and shown how all is harmonized and is connected together as a regular, beautiful, and glorious frame. I don't know if I'll read this whole thing, but he's talking about how the Bible gives us an account of the whole scheme of providence from the beginning to the end. And then at the last part, then he says, how rational, worthy, and excellent a revelation is that, and how excellent a book is the Bible. It contains how much beyond all other books in the world. A divine book, a book that the great Jehovah has given to mankind for their instruction, without which we should be left in miserable darkness and confusion. And my point with the rational restoration, and actually Jonathan Edwards alluded to this too, but that the Book of Mormon was also a book that the great Jehovah has given to all mankind for their instruction. And that's what I show here. You know, the Bible says in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word will be established, both in Matthew and Paul wrote it in the Corinthians in a little different context. And yet the Bible is only one witness. So in order to fulfill God's purposes, there had to be another witness. And that is, of course, the Book of Mormon. Now, some people could argue that the Old Testament and the New Testament are 2 witnesses, but it says 2 or 3 witnesses. So even in that case, you still need the 3rd witness, which is the Book of Mormon. So to me, this is all very biblical, very much in accordance with what Christians have been anticipating and expecting by the words of the Bible itself. Okay, getting back to this idea of the rational restoration and these 3 principles that I discuss in this book. One of the keys to this whole thing is this idea of unity and diversity. And I found something very interesting that I'm going to show you here about the teachings of the latter-day prophets. First, this is from President Veazey here in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 164. He said, over the last several years, the need to resolve various moral and justice issues has intensified and become more complicated because of the growing international diversity of the Church. Through the gospel of Christ, a new community of tolerance, reconciliation, unity and diversity, and love is being born as a visible sign of the coming reign of God. Dallin Oaks used that same phrase about 10 years later. He said, loyalty to established law instead of temporary allies is the best way to love our adversaries and our enemies as we seek unity and diversity. So it's totally congruent. Everybody's seeking in the restoration movement is seeking unity and diversity. And then Quentin Cook amplified that when he said, with our all-inclusive doctrine, we can be an oasis of unity and celebrate diversity. Unity and diversity are not opposites. We can achieve greater unity as we foster an atmosphere of inclusion and respect for diversity. So to me, that's all part of this rational restoration as well, because regardless of our backgrounds, regardless of the religion we grew up with, regardless of what country we live, regardless of what language, dealing with rational understandings can bridge gaps and can bring unity despite diversity. I think rationality is a key to this unity and diversity. I have some examples here. These are kind of funny about these two guys arguing. One guy says it's a frog, and the other guy says it's a horse. And that's because the first guy was thinking of the frog, and the second guy was thinking of a horse. And you can see now that the picture really does depict both. But it depends on their preconception as to what they think that picture shows. And it's a common human problem where people see the same thing, but because of their backgrounds, their training, their expertise, what they've been told, whatever, they see things differently and they even argue about what it is. So everyone's looking at the same facts. Debates over semantics can never be resolved because they consist of word salad and defining terms mostly. No matter how many times you roll the ball up, it'll roll down again, right? And so you see people arguing about these, but we also have, here's another example of this, these guys, one guy thinks it's a 6, the other guy thinks it's a 9, right? And an example that is very common is the discussion of Book of Mormon geography, because people are looking at the same information. Some people think Camaro's in Mexico and some people think it's in New York. So these things exist within the restoration as well as between the restoration and other religions. Now, one other little principle here I want to cover quickly is, do facts matter? And this is a common thing that happens in intellectual pursuits. People read the research, and if they agree with the findings of the research, then they ignore any flaws in the research and they keep their worldview. If they don't agree with the findings of the research, they find a reason the research is flawed, they ignore the research and they keep their worldview. And we've seen this play out in terms of the COVID, the whole debate about vaccinations versus non-vaccinations. Everybody has some support for whatever they believe, and people don't change their minds. Anytime you talk about religion or politics, you end up with this kind of a situation. So the question that has been bothering me all this time is, how do we overcome our biases and find the truth? This is one thing I'm going to propose here, this idea of the multiple working hypotheses. This guy, T.C. Chamberlain, wrote a very influential paper where he outlined this method of multiple working hypotheses. And I'll read this real quickly. He said there are two fundamental classes of study. The one consists of attempting to follow by close imitation the processes of previous thinkers, or to acquire by memorizing the results of their investigations. A lot of school involves memorization or following what previous people have said. It's merely secondary, imitative, or acquisitive study. The other class is primary or creative study. In it, the effort is to think independently, or at least individually, in the endeavor to discover new truth or to make new combinations of truth, or at least to develop an individualized aggregation of truth. Now, that's a big mouthful, but and if any of you are interested, you can have this PowerPoint. I could send it to you. But the basic idea is there's two kinds of study that we can do. He went on to say that the moment that one has offered an original explanation for a phenomenon which seems satisfactory, that moment, affection for his intellectual child springs into existence. And as the explanation grows into a definite theory, his parental affections cluster about his intellectual offspring, and it grows more and more dear to him, so that, while he holds it seemingly tentative, it is still lovingly tentative and not impartially tentative. So soon as this parental affection takes possession of the mind, there is a rapid passage to the adoption of the theory. There is an unconscious selection and magnifying of the phenomena that fall into harmony with the theory and support it, and an unconscious neglect of those that fail of coincidence. And that's basically a lot of words saying what that diagram I showed you earlier said. He said, the mind lingers with pleasure upon the facts that fall happily into the embrace of the theory and feels a natural coldness towards those that seem refractory. Instinctively, there is a special searching out of phenomena that support it, for the mind is led by its desires. There springs up also an unconscious pressing of the theory to make it fit the facts, and a pressing of the facts to make them fit the theory. When these biasing tendencies set in, the mind rapidly degenerates into the partiality of paternalism. The search for facts, the observation of phenomena, and their interpretation are all affected or dominated by affection for the favored theory until it appears to its author or its advocate to have been overwhelmingly established. The theory then rapidly rises to the ruling position, and investigation, observation, interpretation are controlled and directed by it. So briefly summed, the evolution is this: a premature explanation passes into a tentative theory, then into an adopted theory, and then into a ruling theory. When the last stage has been reached, unless the theory happens perchance to be the true one, all hope of the best result is gone. Under the method of multiple hypotheses, it is the first effort of the mind to see truly what the act is, unbeclouded by the presumption that this or that has been done because it accords with our ruling theory or our working hypothesis. So I realize that's a lot of language, but I developed an approach to this that I call the faith model. And I'm going to show that to you, and after I show you two more reframings that kind of is in my mind are a way of expressing this idea of multiple working hypotheses. This one is reframing Joseph's early years. There were two old narratives. Now, again, these are overgeneralizations. I realize there's lots of nuances, but the basic old narratives on the faithful side was that Joseph was an unlearned farm boy with a blank slate mind upon which God could write. The critics would say Joseph Smith was a clever scoundrel who lied about spiritual experiences. And I'm saying a reframe that I'm proposing is that Joseph Smith was prepared by God from a young age to translate an ancient document and articulate modern revelation. And that's different from both of those old narratives. Another one, and I have about 50 of these in this book. Another one is reframing the plates. The old narrative was, the faithful narrative was that there was only one set of ancient golden plates, and Joseph got them from Moroni's stone box. Or the critical narrative was there were never any authentic ancient plates because witnesses gave inconsistent descriptions, and and so on. The reframe is that there were two sets of plates: the abridged plates in Moroni's stone box that Joseph translated in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and the original plates of Nephi from the repository in the Hill Cumorah that Joseph translated in Fayette, New York. I think I've gone through that before in a previous presentation here, but that's the idea of this reframing, these narratives. And to me, these reframes are much more rational than the old narratives. Okay, so now I'm going to show you this idea of this faith model. And this is how I try to approach this to develop multiple working hypotheses. The acronym is FAITH, but the first point is facts, and they should be demonstrable, objective facts that everybody can agree upon. And, to me, this might be one of the hardest things to explain, because a lot of times people disagree about facts, but they're not really disagreeing about the facts. They're disagreeing about their assumptions, which is the second one on here. So if we start with a fact, and then we have assumptions, or things that we assume about those facts given our worldview. And then we make inferences and interpretations. We place those facts into a comfortable context that we like, that fits our ideas. And then we develop a theory, which is our explanation of the facts. And then we end up with a hypothesis or narrative or a belief that's our basis for prediction and further investigation. So that's my faith model that I spell out in this book. And that's how I approach all these issues at this point. The optimum outcome, I'm going to give you an example of it here in just a sec. The optimum outcome of this analysis is a set of multiple working hypotheses, all based on the same facts that people can assess for themselves. While enabling people to make informed decisions, the analysis also hopes to help people understand how and why others reach different conclusions. To me, this is kind of the essence of rationality. And I think the rational restoration helps us accomplish this from the Latter-day Scriptures. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example. This is an example of the faith model from Lucy Mack Smith and the Hill Cumorah. So the facts are that Lucy Mack Smith dictated her history, stating that Moroni told Joseph, quote, "The record is on a side hill on the hill of Cumorah, 3 miles from this place. Remove the grass and moss and you will find a large flat stone." So that's what she wrote. And everybody can agree with that. The 3 categories I put here are M2C, which is Mesoamerica to Cumorah's theory, the non-believers, and people who believe in the New York Cumorah. Okay, this is, I tried to tailor this to one specific issue and one specific fact, but all 3 groups can agree that that's a fact that she wrote that. Okay, that's a fact that's beyond dispute, that's recorded in her history, because you can read it right in the Joseph Smith papers. Now we get into the assumptions. The Mesoamerican view is that Lucy was mistaken. Their assumption is she was mistaken because Cumorah is not in New York. The non-believer's assumption is Lucy was mistaken because Cumorah is imaginary. If Joseph told her this, he made it up. The New York Cumorah people think that their assumption is Lucy was accurate and correct because Cumorah is in New York. So you see how the identical facts change based on the assumptions that people bring to it, based on their worldview. Then we go to inferences. The Mesoamerican approach would infer that Lucy paraphrased what she heard or added anachronistic details. She said hill of Cumorah, which is not the same as the hill Cumorah. So we interpret it to mean a hill like Cumorah, reminiscent of Cumorah. This is the idea that there were 2 hill Cumorahs. The non-believer infers that Lucy wanted to believe it and wanted others to believe it because she naturally trusted her own son. But there's nothing believable about this account. That's their inference. The New York Cumorah person would infer that Lucy heard this directly from Joseph Smith, that Joseph heard it correctly from Moroni, and that Lucy accurately reported what Joseph told her. The words speak for themselves, i.e. Moroni identified the hill where the plates were deposited as Cumorah. So here's how you start with a fact, then you have your assumptions, and then you make this inference to fit your ideas, and then you come up with a tentative theory. So the Mesoamerican approach would be Lucy related this 20 years after the fact, so she must have conflated her memory with the later narrative about Cumorah she heard from someone other than Joseph Smith. But even if she heard it from Joseph, Joseph was speculating along with Oliver Cowdery. I've heard both of those explanations. The non-believer's theory is, at best, Lucy is relating hearsay, what Joseph told her, so it's not even admissible in court. Besides, Joseph's story isn't credible, and even scholars who believe the Book of Mormon is true don't accept what Lucy said here. So that's what the non-believer's theory is. And then the New York Cumorah people would say Lucy related this 20 years after the fact, but she had a good memory, and she repeated the account often, and Joseph never corrected or contradicted her. Lucy also related an 1827 account about Cumorah. There's no good reason to question, let alone reject Lucy's account. So that's the theory that those groups would come up with. Finally, the hypothesis. And this is the hypothesis that they would use to assess other statements to test them related to this topic. So for the Mesoamerican people, they would say Lucy's statement is irrelevant because the actual hill Cumorah is in southern Mexico. The non-believer would say Lucy's statement is irrelevant because any hill Cumorah is fictional, whether it's in New York or anywhere else. And the New York Cumorah people would say Lucy's statement is good evidence that the actual hill Cumorah is in Western New York. So you can see that by going through this process with the identical facts, at the end of the day, you end up exactly where your assumption was at the first step. The second step was your assumption. You go through the analysis and you end up where you expect it to be to begin with. And I use this as an example because it shows that the identical facts can lead to multiple working hypotheses. It's not that the facts change, it's that our assumptions and our worldviews change. So that's how I apply this faith model here again to summarize it. Now, there's another aspect of this that I really like, and that is that everyone can work, shop, learn, play, and participate in society regardless of their beliefs, right? Here in line in this story, you've got a Catholic, an atheist, a Hindu, a pagan, a Mormon, a Baptist, and a Buddhist, and they're all getting along fine, right? Regardless of their beliefs. Here's another one. Here's a family. I found this family on the internet. Here's on Book of Mormon geography issues. All these kids have their Book of Mormon, but these believe New York Cumorah, these believe the Mesoamerica 2 Cumorahs, and these believe an imaginary map. They don't have any idea and they don't really care. Or you can do the same thing with Book of Mormon translation issues. Some believe Joseph used the Urim and Thummim, some believe he used the stone and the hat, and others don't know and don't care. But they still love the Book of Mormon and they abide by its teachings. That's the point. So I'm going to go back to Jonathan Edwards one more time briefly, and then we're almost out of time. I didn't get to all the good stuff, but I'll do this as quick as I can. Okay. This is really a key point, and I think the Restoration teaches us this. 'Tis with God's work of providence as it is with his work of creation. 'Tis but one work. God's works of providence bean't disunited and jumbled without connection or dependence, but all are united, just as the several parts of one building. There are many stones, many pieces of timber, but all are so joined and fitly framed together that they make but one building. They all have but one foundation and are united at last in one topstone. That's a picture of where the Ohio River and the Mississippi River meet at Cairo down there. God's providence may not unfitly be compared to a large and long river, having innumerable branches beginning in different regions and at a great distance one from another, and all conspiring to one common issue. This is, of course, the map of the tributaries of the Mississippi River. The different streams of this river are ready to look like mere jumble and confusion to us because of the limitedness of our sight, whereby we can't see from one branch to another and can't see the whole at once, so as to see how all are united in one. A man that sees but one or two streams at a time can't tell what their course tends to. Their course seems very crooked, and the different streams seem to run for a while different and contrary ways. And if we view things at a distance, there seem to be innumerable obstacles and impediments in the way to hinder their ever uniting and coming to the ocean, as rocks and mountains and the like. But yet if we trace them, they all unite at last, and all come to the same issue, disgorging themselves in one into the same great ocean. Not one of all the streams fail of coming hither at last. So that's how Jonathan Edwards described this, the creation of God being so complex and interdependent and even confusing at times, but it's all united. And then again, here's this, this idea that what Joseph and Oliver told the truth, what they taught makes sense, and what they taught is corroborated by external evidence. Now, I had a whole bunch more about when the Restoration began, all this, but I realized I think I've used our hour, haven't I, Paul? You're on mute, so I can't hear you.
Yes, we are close to it. And so possibly you could put more of that in with the question and answers.
Yeah, let's do that, because I gave you here, hopefully let me stop sharing here. I wanted to give you the flavor of what I'm trying to do in this book, which is to show that the Restoration is based on rationality, that it makes us more rational people, and that God expects to reason with us. And that's the way I think, by understanding this idea of rationality and how we can have multiple working hypotheses, is a way for us to unite as people, regardless of our background, and perhaps come together on some of our beliefs and so on as well through this process, but more importantly, to become united in coming closer to God and becoming more like Christ, and to fulfill the purpose of the Book of Mormon, which is to convince people that Jesus is the Christ. So that's the gist of what I'm all about anyway. So I'm happy to discuss any questions.
Well, let me invite people then to go to the reactions on the page and raise your hand. And Deb, as host, I get the first question, and I'm intrigued by a coincidence and detail, because you mentioned the Mormonizing, these earthquakes being caused by Mormons.
Yeah.
I was doing some research on slavery and Mormonism, and fascinating set of stories. But once the Mormons had been driven out of Missouri, that I believe it was the Senator Atchison, that he wanted to Mormonize the abolitionists. The idea to Mormonize the abolitionists, because abolitionists and Mormons were both such awful creatures, awful people, that getting rid of them, exterminating them, was the appropriate course of action.
Okay.
For people to be associating earthquakes with Mormons, there's a history of that kind of thing, and so I just want to get that comment in. I also
Yeah.
want,
Well, that thing that he was, I tried looking up what newspaper said the earthquakes in China were Mormonism over there. I had no idea. I couldn't find it anywhere. So I don't know if anybody's ever looked that up to see what he was referring to.
well, let me thank you. I really do the research you pulled together and the excellent making again. And I am particularly honored that you would pull in a couple of quotes from the Modern Revolution, because I think that does highlight the importance of reasoning together all across the movement. And I think it also calls to our attention the need for us to look reasonably at the scriptures of other people as well.
Yeah, totally.
Jesus went to other sheep, and he told us he did that before coming to the Americas, and then he still had other sheep to go visit. That means we have to find, and I think you highlighted that point. The Swami that saw God in India is a good example. We need to think. I want to thank you for that very much. It's a rich experience to share.
Well, along those lines, it's been fascinating for me, because everywhere I go in the world, if you talk to people for more than 20 minutes, they'll tell you about their spiritual experiences and how God has intervened in their life and protected them or guided them or whatever. And it makes essentially no difference what religion they are, and it's really fascinating. One time, for example, when I was in India, my host wanted me to have a dinner with their Swami, or their leader, whatever they called him. But in order to do that, I had to be Hindu. And so they had me go through this ceremony where I had to do a bunch of this stuff, and they put flowers on me and all this. And whatever I did, it satisfied them. So I was Hindu enough to go and meet with their Swami and have dinner with them. So, and I was cool with it. They have a lot of really wonderful traditions and beliefs as well. So I just see it as the Book of Mormon, as far as I know, is the only scripture that teaches that God has inspired people everywhere in the world. And I just think that's such an important message for people to have.
All right. Well, Val has his hand up. So let's
Okay.
Okay, enjoyed your presentation, Jonathan. Can you say a little bit about what you think the telos of reason is? What does God want us to get from our use of reason? I ask this in part because it seems to me the world is structured in such a way that if a person wants to be an atheist, they can find the facts that support that view. If they want to be a believer, they can find the facts that support that view. And I think God probably wants the world to be that way, that our our preferences in some sense. We kind of create our own world. We co-create the world. God's
Mhm.
given us a world, but we also get to choose the world we live in. And some people live in a world where there is no God. All of us, I think, on this forum live in a world where there is a God, and not just a God, but also where the Book of Mormon is true. and
Mhm.
and of course, there's a lot more people that live in a world where the Book of Mormon isn't true. And I don't think for the most part, I don't think the Lord lets us be compelled to have some kind of belief. And it actually, in Alma 32, he talks there about how if you have knowledge, you don't have choice anymore. In a sense, you're compelled once you have knowledge. And so agency, in a sense, requires that there be uncertainty and multiple ways of framing the facts. And I think it also requires that we, in a sense, get to, at least in part, create the world we live in. Now, we don't get to control all the consequences. If we're wrong about stuff, we can face some negative consequences,
Mhm.
and so bad ideas lead to bad outcomes. But I don't think there's ever enough evidence to compel people to any particular conclusion. That's true for Book of Mormon geography. I think it's true for just about everything in life.
Yeah, I agree. I've pointed out when it comes to history, we don't even know who the drummer was on the Beatles song, Dear Prudence. And they've had experts do everything they could to try to figure out who the drummer was. And that was, 40 years ago. And two of the Beatles are alive today and they don't even remember. So this idea of trying to figure out what actually happened in history, it's just not a possible thing. And I also agree with you that to some extent reality is subjective, because we experience reality through our own filters. What I'm trying to accomplish here, in the sense of the telos of rationality, I think if people can understand one another. Remember, I said there was one of the objectives was to understand our own beliefs, but the other is to understand why other people believe the way they do. And that's where this importance of unity, the diversity through unity, can come into play, because I don't have to agree with an atheist, and I don't care if the atheist agrees with me, but I want us to both understand why we both think what we think. And that's where I think this idea of the multiple working hypotheses, where everybody can agree, here are facts, and spell out our assumptions and our inferences and our theories and our hypotheses, so that it's all laid out so we can all have a better understanding of one another. I think that when we do that, we find that regardless of what our assumptions are, we can be united in our objective of creating a better society and being better people. And that,
One thing I would say there is you have to couple reason with charity. So charity is what would lead you to have that kind. But a second problem, a problem from what you just said would be, if you look into the philosophy of science, it turns out that facts and theory are totally woven together. Your theories typically determine the facts, and so if people have different theories, they actually end up with different facts, and that makes it difficult to end up.
that same thing happens when looking at history, because people think something's a fact because someone said it. What the fact is that someone said it, not that what they said was true necessarily. And that's the same with the difference between facts and theory and science. A good example of that is, the idea of creationism versus pure evolution. And the encoding in the DNA molecules and the proteins and amino acids is so complex that when they've been doing calculations on the probability of it happening randomly, the probability is so infinitesimal that they developed the multiple universe theory to have enough possibilities. And when you look at that rationally, you would say, at least I say when I look at that coding is so sophisticated that it had to have been created. That's how, in my worldview, I can understand the math of, multiplying. It's not impossible that it was done randomly through evolution, but the chances are so infinitesimal likely that they have to have the multiple universes to make it work. And so, but that's an example of if we can all agree on the fact of the complexity and the probability of those amino acids in proteins and stuff, we can all agree that on those facts, but it's our assumptions that we bring to it, how we interpret those facts.
I'll make a last comment and then open it up for others. Edward Howlett Carr wrote a great book called What is History years ago. And in it, he said that a thing becomes a historical fact when it's put into a narrative somebody tells. Not everything
Right.
that happened in the past is a historical fact, but
Right.
but what historians sometimes do is they take something that's just an event that happened in the past, and they suddenly tell a story where that becomes important. It has causal effects.
Mhm.
That's what makes it a historical fact. So it shows you how the theory and the event, or the fact is not really a fact, or at least a historical fact, until it's embedded in a narrative, a story. So facts are problematic. That's the only point I would be making here. They're so interwoven with theory that what counts as a fact, and you can't really have facts without theories, and theories without facts are all tied together. And if people come from two different incommensurable theories, they won't even agree on, they have a hard time agreeing on what's relevant to the
Yeah.
discussion.
You know, Val, that's a good point. That's been one of my biggest challenges in addressing this whole stone in the hat thing, because as I dealt with various historians and critics, they say, well, no, Joseph did this. And I said, no, you don't know what he did. You know what someone said he did. And you know, and when I practice law in a trial, you have to make sure you get the opportunity to cross-examine a witness, which makes a big difference. We can't do that with historical figures. But you can point out that the witness said something happened, and you can point out, well, either they weren't there, they weren't looking, they just assumed a fact that they didn't observe, all those kind of things. And people are constantly mixing up what they observed with what they assumed they saw. And so that's what, when I try to say we can all agree to a fact, it's like the example I gave of Lucy Mack Smith. It's a fact that she wrote that in, or that she dictated that, and it's in the Joseph Smith papers. We can all read that fact. People will say, well, it's not a fact because that didn't happen, or Moroni didn't tell her that. Well, I'm not saying that what she said happened. I'm saying it's a fact that she said it happened. And that's the fact part of it. Everything beyond that is assumption, inference, and so on. And that's why I think it's so far when I've had discussions with people and I tease out the difference between a fact and an assumption and an inference, I've been able to get to the point where everybody agrees, okay, you're right, that is the fact. Everything else was an assumption. And I think it's possible to do that in science as well. So great comments though. Who's next?
Okay, we got Monty. Monty, go ahead, please. Monty, I need you to get closer to your
Yeah, I
microphone.
can't hear.
Not coming across.
The one thing that I picked out early in the presentation was the first time I heard the rational popularization about the Book of Mormon coming from two separate sets of gold plates. Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. Okay, I can explain that real quick if you'd like.
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea is that, and I think I may have presented this before on Paul's show here, but when Joseph took the plates, he took them down to Harmony, and that was the abridged plates. And we know that those are the abridged plates because the title page explains what the content was. It had the abridgment of the record of the Nephites, abridgment of the record of the Jaredites, and then it had Moroni sealed it, which means he wrote the last part and, you know, put it all together, put it in there. The title page doesn't say anything about any original plates. And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, in these LDS section 9, when the Lord told Oliver Cowdery he could translate, but he wasn't able to, he said, I want you to finish this record, and then I have additional records that you can help Joseph translate. In the very next section, section 10, Joseph and Oliver had contemplated going back to retranslate the book of Lehi that was lost with 116 pages. And the Lord said, no, you can't, don't go back and do that. Now you have to translate the plates of Nephi. But they didn't have the plates of Nephi in Harmony. And that's why when they left Harmony, before he left Harmony, Joseph gave those plates to this divine messenger who he later identified as one of the three Nephites. And that guy, he gave him the plates. David Whitmer came down from Fayette to pick him up in the wagon. And on the way back, they passed the guy along the side of the road. You probably remember that account where they confronted this guy and David offered him a ride. And the guy said, no, I'm going to Cumorah. And David said he didn't know what Cumorah was. He'd never heard of it before. When they proceeded on to Fayette, the same messenger came with the plates of Nephi and gave them to Joseph. That's why Joseph translated the plates of Nephi in Fayette, not in Harmony. And so, and that explains what it appears is that the 8 witnesses saw the plates of Nephi because none of them said there was a sealed portion. And Joseph's father weighed them and said they weighed 30 pounds. The other witnesses, at least Martin Harris and I think David said they weighed 60 pounds. So they would have seen or held the abridged plates. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the basic idea, is that this messenger took the abridged plates from Harmony back to Cumorah, to the repository, found the plates of Nephi, and took those to Fayette. And that's why Joseph translated those in Fayette.
Okay, well, I'm a little confused, but that's okay. The two facts that I have deduced early in my Christian life that I still hold to firmly is, number one, there is a God, and number two, he isn't me.
I couldn't hear the second one, number 2.
Number two, he isn't me.
He is.
Yes, okay. I'm with you on that. Well done.
All right. It looks like we have Ron and then Paul. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a colleague who taught at the university where I taught, and he was a biology professor, and he said, it seems to me to be very useful. He said that a fact is a reported observation. And of course, the most interesting thing about a fact is whether or not it's true, but what I've found is that when I'm talking with people about these sorts of things, that if you go to that understanding of a fact, the question is, did somebody report it and did they observe it? And then you can agree on those things. And a good example, as you pointed out, was in Lucy Max. She reported it and
Yeah.
that observation. So that makes it a fact. And then you can worry about the assumptions and everything else about whether or not it's true. So this isn't anything different than what you said, but that was a nice way. I thought it was a nice way to talk about facts versus the theories. So I just thought
I like that a lot. And I think it's one step towards reaching cordiality and collaboration is to agree on something. And if you can agree on the fact, it makes it easier to discuss your assumptions and inferences more peacefully and more rationally.
Yeah.
It's sometimes people think they're arguing about what a fact is, and if you can break through that and everybody can understand we're all looking at the exact same fact,
yeah,
it really helps.
I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ron. Okay, Paul, go ahead, please.
Let me, first of all, again for next week, because we have one of those interesting fact relationships with Rainbow hitting the medicine wheel that he thinks was actually on the temple grounds, Independence, prior to the white men coming and messing it up. So pile of rocks, evidence there. Will be an interesting presentation next week and hopefully give people a chance to gain another perspective. I want to go back to the question of facts. As an archaeologist, I find it very important to be able to measure things.
Mhm.
At Nauvoo, we started out under Robert Bray because it was an English site. We used English measure. We were told that each of the blocks was 1 acre, and the idea each of the blocks was 1 acre meant that we had basically a 400-foot block. Main Street was we had 3 different measurements historically on Main Street, and 82, 87, 103 feet. But then we got to digging. Actually, we put 110-foot squares on block 147 Mansion House site and found features on 97 of those squares. We went to the Joseph Smith Senior and came up with a real conundrum because that was supposed to be a log house, and the place had been plowed out. The scatter of artifacts showed us that the footings of that house must have been roughly 25 by 40 feet. To have a 40-foot log house was so unacceptable that I wrote it up, but got my ears burned by specialists that knew what they were talking about. And then we found a roughly 25 by 40-foot double log house in the historic farm site at Des Moines that had been moved there from northern Missouri. Well, the neat part there was that when we then started working on Samuel Smith's site, we found ourselves all messed up because the block that was supposed to be 1 acre wasn't, and we were 20 feet off in terms of measuring back from where it's supposed to be. So my brother got involved in the whole process, and we ended up going to the museum and finding a chain so that we could chain the way the Mormons did, because the Mormons were using rods and chains, not per chance. And so we then discovered that the 5 meters is essentially the same measurement as 1 rod. If we had gone with the original student archaeologist, instead of shifting to the English, we've been a lot closer to the period. And so the nature of the measurements that you use to establish your facts can easily throw you off.
You know, I have 2 little anecdotes about that. If you go to the in Kirtland down where they recreated that mill house, you know, they have the ashery there. They built that whole building. After they built it, they discovered they put it in the wrong place because they found the actual ashery about 50 feet to the south. and they were so embarrassed that the archaeologist that did it told me about this. He said, I guess President Hinckley was going out there to inspect it, you know, to see all this money they spent, and they didn't say a word about the mistake. And then the other thing is the in Fayette, the Whitmer home that they recreated the cabin there, they found that now they've used ground penetrating radar, and apparently it was a double cabin, so it was twice as big as what is there recreated. So you're right, all these things happen. We learn more and more what we think was a fact in archaeology. We have new discoveries. And just look at all the discoveries over in at Stonehenge, you know, around there too. So good points.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, James Lucas, go ahead, please.
Okay. So I've heard your faith presentation before, and I guess the question I have always had is, so where do you go from there? I mean, you have a sort of a basis for understanding where other people are coming from, and that's a good thing because you can have acknowledge your diversity, but know where everybody's coming from, And the more you understand other people, the better the chances are that you're going to all get along. And that's all a very good thing. But how do you, I guess the question I always have had is, what's the next step? Now, in this, the whole point of the scientific method is that supposedly experimentation is the next step where you test the different presentations of facts. And, supposedly everybody agrees on the criteria for evaluating the results of the tests, which is actually not always true, but at least that's the idea. And, the history of science is such that there are at least some things where, people actually say, oops, well, I guess your experiment was good and it showed that the facts I was trying to push are not correct interpretations. And that's the essence of the scientific method. So, but of course, a lot of egos and a lot of anger and a lot of, intemperance often accompanies scientists' efforts to do that. But nonetheless, there's a program, at least, that sort of theoretically everybody agrees on, to move on beyond everyone's assumptions to try to test them out and come somewhere closer to what may be some kind of objective truth. So I guess my question is in your model, is there any place for testing and pushing the factual interpretations and the inferences and the assumptions to try to test them out? Or is your model basically more directed toward being able to more clearly understand where people are coming from so that we can have a greater appreciation and sympathy for other people's points of view? And that's the main, that's the ultimate objective.
Okay. Yeah, well, the guy who developed this method of multiple working hypotheses was a scientist, and he did it specifically because in some cases there are multiple hypotheses that all work. And it's not just in quantum physics where there's spooky things, that things act differently, Schrodinger's cat and all that stuff. It's not just in that. There's some aspects of biology where there's multiple hypotheses of how things happen. And the point of it is to say, here's a panel or a spectrum of hypotheses. We don't know which one is the best or the true, because they all work. And so, and that's kind of how I see these issues as well. For example, on the Book of Mormon geography is an easy one to talk about. Like I showed that little family is to depict, or the people at the store. Everybody can go to the store, everybody can accept and live by the Book of Mormon, regardless of what they think about geography. And there's no need to really argue about it once everybody understands where everybody's coming from. And I don't think it's possible to ever determine what actually happened in history, for example. Like I mentioned that Dear Prudence song from the Beatles, we'll never resolve that. If we can't resolve who the drummer was on that song, how do we know what happened when Joseph Smith was doing whatever he was doing, right? And so that's why I say the way to eliminate the arguments and contention is by understanding. And we can all agree on the facts. Once we understand what a fact is, that's not easy to do, but once you understand what a fact is, we can all agree on those facts. And then the impact of the assumptions and inferences kind of leap out, and those become more apparent. And then people on the outside who've never encountered whatever the issue is could say, okay, I see your facts. Now I can follow your reasoning, how you got to where you are. That one resonates with me, or this other one resonates with me. It's really kind of a probability assessment, I guess, is the best way to look at it. To say, let's say there's three alternative hypotheses, again, using the geography as an example, the Mesoamerican two Comoros thing, the non-believer, and the one Comoro New York person. Those three are alternatives. Any person can look at those and understand how they reach their hypothesis once we agree on the facts. And what's been missing in every discussion of history, theology, all these areas that I've encountered is no one agrees on the facts. And it's crazy because the facts are the facts. It's just people don't understand the difference between the fact and an assumption. And it maybe having to practice law may be more sensitive to that or something, but I think it's possible for people to do that. And then once you understand that people's beliefs and hypotheses are rational, given the facts that they had, there's no reason to argue or be angry about it, right? I think that's one of the things that really came out in that sermon that guy reported, Joseph Smith gave. I so wish we had the exact transcript. But he said he was giving a rational explanation and that the things he was teaching would make people more rational. I mean, that is a huge insight into the restoration that has been overlooked, I think. And that's, so I guess to answer your question, I'm not advocating any pursuit of the ultimate truth, because I think the truth is subjective to some degree, because each one of us reacts to it differently. What I think the end result should be, and hopefully would be, to understand ourselves, but also to understand everybody else and recognize that we have common interests and we can achieve it, just like the different streams from the tributaries eventually merge. I think that's where we will eventually merge, but we need that understanding first.
Okay. No, that's clarifies kind of, I always was not clear where you were
Yeah.
going with this whole faith
Yeah,
analysis.
fair enough.
That clarifies that. Thank you.
Okay.
So
Go
I'll
ahead.
pass on to the next person.
Okay, it's Rick's turn. Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Thanks for presenting this evening. I have a question for you about the Cumorah issue.
Mhm.
You said there's some issues we just can't resolve. How would you feel about resolving the Cumorah issue if you believe that the New York Cumorah is the only Cumorah? Wouldn't it be feasible to dig it up to prove yourself right?
Yeah. You think I have it?
I don't know. I haven't heard anything in the news. I haven't heard
Well-
anything in the channels here on the Book of Mormon Zoom forum
Yeah.
about
Well,
the library being found.
Well, okay, there's a good answer to that, because I was curious, and I'll tell you guys, hopefully none of this is, well, I guess it is recorded. Maybe I shouldn't say too much, but there was a report about 20 years ago now, 15, 20 years ago, of the room that they found on the Hill Cumorah. It was just below where the statue is. And I have pictures of it. It's a laid up brick, kind of, not brick, but stone room. And it matches the description that Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff gave, but it was empty. And Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer both said that the records are no longer in the Hill Cumorah. David Whitmer said they were still in New York. They were not far from Cumorah, but they weren't in Cumorah. And Oliver Cowdery said they weren't there anymore. And so I wrote a little book about whatever happened to the golden plates. And when you read what Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and Wilford Woodruff said that Oliver told them, because Brigham Young made the point that Oliver never talked about this in public, but he said he and Joseph went to the repository at least twice. And Brigham Young said that there was, I think he was the one that said there were 6 wagon loads of records in there. And so, and I think Heber C. Kimball said more than a 6-mule team could haul, or something like words to that effect. And so I started thinking, well, we know that Mormon moved the records from the Hill Shim to the Hill Cumorah. And I think the reason he moved them to Cumorah was because it was the fortress that had been built by the Jaredites that he knew was still there. So he didn't have a lot of time to build a fort. It was underground fortress. So he moved it all the records to this place that the Jaredites had already left. And then when Joseph Smith finished the translation, he and Oliver went and they reported that, or at least Oliver reported that the records were stacked and there was a stone shelf with records on it and all that stuff. They knew that there was going to be the treasure hunters looking for those records. And that's when David Whitmer was asked about it. He said the treasure hunters in Rochester will never find them because they're not there anymore, but they're not far from there. So when he said they weren't far from there, and Brigham Young and those guys talked about the quantity in terms of wagon loads, I surmised, this is just my thinking, that Joseph and Oliver and Joseph's brothers, because Brigham said they were there too, moved all those records back to the Hill Shim. That's what I think happened. And the problem is we don't know where the Hill Shim is. But it's somewhere not too far from there. David Whitmer said it wasn't far from there, and it couldn't have been too far because Mormon moved all the records there in the first place. But let's say within 20 miles or so, probably. So I think the idea of digging up the Hill Cumorah, if you understood what David and Oliver said, would be pointless anyway, which I think is why they haven't done it. Other than the room. And the room, I have pictures from the room, you could see. Some people think it was a farmer was storing potatoes up there on the hill or something, but it's right at the top of the hill, or near the top of the hill, where that statue is. And I've also been told that when they built that statue originally in the 1930s, they had to dig it pretty deep to put a big concrete foundation in there, and they broke into a chamber at that point too. And they just filled it with cement because it was empty. And that's what that whole Moroni statue is on top of. And I think it was Wolfwood Woodruff that said there were multiple chambers underground there. So it all makes sense to me. But
so if I wanted to read more about that, could I just find it online by typing in room on Cumorah or room in Cumorah?
I've never tried Googling it. I wrote a little book about it called Whatever Happened to the Golden Plates. It's on Kindle Unlimited if you get that.
What was it, Unlimited?
Kindle Unlimited.
Oh, Kindle, Kindle.
Yeah. So it's in print, it's on Amazon, it's a Deseret book and so on. But I have all the references in there. I have a diagram. I have a webpage called Letter 7, LETTERVII, Roman numeral 7, letter7.com. And on there, I have the diagram that shows the whole thing about the two sets of plates and so on.
Okay, so you put the Roman numerals. You'd put the Roman numerals into the Google search or to the internet search.
I just put the link here on the chat.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's really interesting about the Hill Cumorah. Let me just tell you, I was pretty obsessed with, I don't like to leave things unturned, okay? So that's why we bought a house out there. And then we bought a farm out there with my brother. And it had several of these moraines on it because I'd read in some of the writings that these things are gravel and there's no way there could be a cave or a room in them. And so I got a backhoe and I dug one up. And you could definitely put a room in there because they're not all gravel. Most of them are clay, and it's heavy, thick clay that is actually difficult to dig through. I can't do it by hand, at least not with my physique, or my time. So even with the backhoe, it was difficult to dig into. So the things that I've heard from some of these Mesoamerican apologists that Cumorah couldn't be in New York because it's a pile of gravel is just not true. But I learned that myself by digging it. Plus, there's a whole series of subterranean caves along there in northwestern New York. Some of them are open to visitors and some aren't. So, but that's a longer topic, so I don't want to take everybody else's time.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps.
My next thing is short. You really made my day because you're the first Hindu I know that believes the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, well, I think there's others. I know of others actually, because I went to church in Mumbai and there were Hindu converts at the branch there.
Oh, no, I don't mean Hindu converts, I mean Hindus. You converted to Hinduism, they converted to Restorationism.
Okay, but they still seem to feel Hinduish. You know what, when we lived in Mauritius, which is an African country, is predominantly Hindu, majority Hindu. there's Hindus who join the church, but they're still Hindu. They add Statue of Moroni or Christ to their other Hindu gods, basically. And
Wow.
they still have that kind of it's almost an ecumenical approach, I would say. So,
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
okay.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, Paul, it's your turn, and then Monty. Go ahead, Paul.
All right, I would like to thank James Lucas for his question because it feeds into mine so nicely. That's going back to the multiple working hypotheses. It seems to me that means that there's lots of ways to be wrong.
For sure. Yeah.
How does that line up with the concept of Zion?
Well, because I get back to the tributary thing in the river. We all have our different courses and our different beliefs. I don't think any two people agree on everything. And so I think you can be successful. That's what I tried to show in that diagram of the family. You can accept the Book of Mormon, abide by its teachings, come closer to Christ, even if you disagree about the geography of the translation or these other issues, because those are ancillary. The only two purposes set out in the Book of Mormon for its purpose was to teach scattered Israel about the covenants, right? And to convince, and to the convincing that Jesus is the Christ. Those are the only two things. It didn't say anything about joining a church, didn't say anything about all these other issues. Those are the two purposes for the Book of Mormon, why it was written. And I think as long as we keep those uppermost in our own minds and in our own, the way we act, we can be accommodative of all kinds of variety.
Well, my wife had, she wanted to make back relative to your issues on immortality.
Yes. 52 years ago, when Paul and I went to Tahiti, my mom's cousin found out we were there and knew that Paul was an archaeologist and he's in. So she told us of her story. She was quite young with a baby, but she said she became really sick. And that evening, she passed on. And she saw herself on the bed in the living room. Her family was cleaning her up, trying to get her ready because that night people are coming.
Mm-hmm.
She was watching them do that, you know, clean her up and get her ready. She got out of the house and started walking toward the beach and went right through the water. And she said, as she kept walking, she could see the fish coming by her.
Wow.
She got to a place that she came up like on the earth again. And there were people, her relatives. And she talked to them. She said it was so beautiful and she wanted to stay there. And someone that was of authority, she thought, she did not know who this man was, but this man told her, you need to go back.
Mm-hmm.
Your baby is crying. You need to go and take care of your baby. So I would say, she said maybe around 5:30, around there, when she passed on. And then she walked, and then she came back. The house was full of people. They came to pray for her, and you know, it's the, how do you say, the wake?
Yeah, several
Yeah.
nights.
Mm-hmm.
And but when she came back, she went back into her body and woke up. It scared everybody in that house. They did not know what to do with her. They
Mm-hmm.
thought it was a ghost. And the Tahitian people do believe in ghosts. And so here she was, back to life, and they knew that she was dead. She was on the bench.
She had been there several
And
hours.
Mhm.
that story, she said, she could not talk about that to any of those people that were there. Held that for the longest time. And people don't really want to talk to her. She was kind of weird, you know, I don't know how to explain it. But for me, it was things were going through my mind. And I said that this is one of those mysteries, you know, of God that we can't explain it. But she said that the reason why she was able to release and have freedom of that, because she went to one of our reunions. This is a church reunion, and there, and that was at Theo, and the psychologist, who is the apostle at the time, was encouraging people to take the burden that they have and leave it at the foot of Jesus, so they don't have to carry that anymore, because she carried that for years. And it was, you know, it was a good thing, because the people there were some of those people that were at her.
Mhm.
And so she's able to talk about it. And with the psychologist there, we're able to make it so everybody was okay with that situation.
Mhm.
Me, you know, you read it in the Bible where someone died for 3 days and it stunk and everything, and then was
Mhm.
come back to life, and then
Right.
taken death. You know, they died for sure. Then I question, you know, I question about things like that that
Mhm.
I don't know the answer. And I always remember Mama Amelia's story, because it did happen.
Mhm.
Like you said, it's a fact, that's the truth. And she held that in her. And she felt like she needed to tell Paul and myself. And to me, that is one of those mysteries God has that I don't know the answer.
Well, you know, when I had my near-death experience, I didn't experience that, nothing to that degree, but I've talked to many people who have. And, you know, it makes sense if you think about it. I kind of have, we don't need to spend a lot of time on kind of what I think about, but for me, when I had that experience, it really was going into a different realm of reality. Just briefly, in Earth time, it was real brief, but it seemed like a long time when I was experiencing it. And so to me, it's just a normal part of life. I mean, it's not even strange anymore. So to hear your friend's story is perfectly normal, the way I look at things. But it might take some reframing for people who haven't experienced that. I mean, for me, I had always heard this idea of your life flashing in front of you. I had no idea it was literally your entire life, everything that ever happened, you know. And so it's inexplicable to me too, except that the restoration, the gospel really teaches us that we lived before we came here. And the school is basically an experience. All these things will be for thy good, as we talked about tonight. And people do have, for whatever reason, sometimes their spirit leaves their body and comes back. So, yeah, that's cool. I think it's great.
Well, let me go back to an earlier comment, because I did want that with our diverse presentations, we've had the land of Nephi in Georgia, we've had it in Guatemala, in Peru, in the Malay Peninsula. We've had it in Joseph Smith's head. And all of these multiple theses nonetheless have resulted in basic common agreement in the statement from Helaman that said, behold, the resurrection of Christ redeemeth mankind, yea, even all mankind, bringeth them to the presence of the Lord. So it's this fundamental ethical book that Christ is in the process of redeeming mankind, and that we can agree on these fundamentals, even though we disagree on our opinions about other things about it.
Well, and you know, I really think what I showed in that thing, that people can have different beliefs about these things. For me, it was because I try to be analytical and rational. You know, I was a Mesoamerican guy for decades. I went down there, I followed all the farms people, you know, the whole deal for decades, until I started saying, well, I wonder what was the factual basis for that. And I went through it. I'm doing a kind of an in-depth scholarly article right now about this whole thing, but I changed my mind completely. And so, but I'm not saying anybody else needs to. I feel like I need to explain why I did, because people ask me all the time. And to me, it's so obvious now and so much more rational, but that's just because of the way I look at it. You know, I'm fine with people believing whatever they want. And so I think it's liberating, really, to not feel compelled to try to persuade someone to agree with you. I have no desire or need to have anyone agree with me. And the only reason I write these books is because people ask me questions and it saves me time. I can just refer to a book instead of having to explain everything every time. And so, but I think that's why I'm hoping, my wife hopes anyway, this is the last book that I do, because for me, this whole idea of spelling out the rational restoration underlies all the other issues. And if people can kind of acquire this distinction between facts and assumptions, inferences, and all the rest, we can reach the point where we all are, we're all fine with not agreeing because we can understand each other. For me, in a way, it's like when I learn a new language. So I know French, so I've done presentations in France and stuff. And because I can speak French, I can understand the people in France, and we can have a conversation and they're comfortable with it. But still, my real language is English, right? But it doesn't mean French is a better or worse language. It's just a different language. And that's the way I feel about the Mesoamerican thing, or the atheists, whatever it is. I'm fine with them living the life that they want to live because I can understand where they're coming from. I don't feel like I was going to go through a whole thing tonight on what happened with John Calvin, and so it's really interesting history with him, because I was in Geneva talking about this, and one of the persons said, you know, the Restoration really started here in Geneva with John Calvin, right? But Calvin, in turn, had one of his critics burned at the stake, so he wasn't that tolerant himself, you know. And anyway, I was going to use that as an anecdote to make a point, maybe for another time. But anyway, okay, Monty again.
Yeah, Monty, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to take a moment to say how much I appreciate the presentation tonight. And I agree with your point of view. And I really am happy that we can all, you know, find something interesting to talk about without disagreeing on everything, without taking it to heart or getting angry, you know, that type of thing. I myself had a near-death experience one time, but I didn't have my whole life flash in front of me, and I was never regretting that because it was so boring the first time.
Well, I appreciate that. And that's, you know, I think Paul's done an exemplary job in this forum of just having people present, and it's not, people can ask questions and challenge and so on, but I don't think anybody here feels a need to convince someone else of their own beliefs, right? We're just sharing what we believe. And that's really healthy. And it's productive and positive. And that's why, you know, I'm happy to participate whenever I can in this group, because you guys are pretty unique, really.
Jonathan, I have just a couple comments, if I might. I don't
Sure.
normally chime in, but you were showing the two pictures, or at least I saw two pictures for the possibility of the cover of your new book.
Uh-huh.
Just a thought from my own perspective, the cover with the trees and the green is a much more inviting
Yeah.
cover for something if I were to, which I probably will get it no matter what you put on the cover, but to me, that's just more inviting and more inclusive to a lot of other people who may be inclined to buy the book. And secondly, I really enjoyed your topic tonight. I saw you when you presented with Stephen Pinecker, and you
Oh,
talked
yeah.
about some of this stuff. I was listening when I was at the gym, and it was really, it brings it all kind of down into a simplistic,
Mhm.
not simplistic. It uncomplicates things, I guess. And so I appreciate what you've done with the presentation.
Well, I appreciate that. In fact, I should have done a poll on those book covers. Let me tell you about the forest one. It was AI generated. I went on artificial intelligence and typed in something like, I don't know if I typed in rational restoration, but something like that. And the AI gave me several options. And so I picked one and refined it and ended up with that one. And I like it the best too.
Yeah.
But, and I think you're right, because the one with the statue kind of focuses too much on that element of it.
Mhm.
And so, but the other one's a little mysterious, and, you know,
Yeah.
so. But I do think for me, part of the rational part of the restoration is it is simple. It's so liberating to think that Joseph and Oliver told the truth. What they said is accurate, and the evidence corroborates what they said. It gets so complicated when people try to say, well, Joseph and Oliver were speculating, or they didn't really know, or maybe they thought this, you know. I think they had nothing that they could do but relate what actually happened. And that's why I think it's so cool with the Cumorah, the translation, and all the other issues. It just really is simple. But what happens though is if the Hill Cumorah is in New York, that drives our interpretation of the text as well. Because there's been a long time, there's been a narrative that there were millions of Jaredites killed at the final battle, but that's not what the text says. And if you read the text carefully, it was less than 10,000 Jaredites. And that's what Oliver Cowdery said all the way back in 1835, you know. And as far as the number of Nephites, it wasn't this 250,000 people killed and so on. I've talked about that before, but it just really simplifies it and helps us appreciate the archaeological evidence that there is. We're not looking for millions of people. It was never part of it. So anyway.
Now, do you have a website for your artwork?
Not yet. I'm doing a show later this month, and they need me to do pictures and stuff for that. So eventually I'll do a web page. I don't really ever sell any of this stuff. I have a gallery that wants to show it, but I don't have enough pieces yet for it. I will later this summer, though. If I keep, unless I do too many more of these presentations, I need time to paint.
Well, they look very beautiful from what we can see from.
Yeah, I don't know how much you can see. This one's underway. It's got another couple days on it, but it's going to be pretty cool. It's a feature here down the coast from where we live called Thor's Well, where the ocean, there's a big hole in the rocks, and the ocean just disappears down in it. It's really pretty amazing. So, well, thank you all very much.
Oh, Lee, did you have a question?
I do, for Jonathan.
Okay.
Sure.
I needed to get that link and I searched everywhere on my phone. I'm not on a tablet or a computer. And I can't find it, that link that you punched
The
in.
link to
Oh.
the letter 7.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll put it another way because it's also,
I can't save it. How do I save it?
how do you save it?
Yeah,
Oh, I don't know.
because it's too fast. I can't write that fast.
Well, if you could, I don't know, put your email down here and I could email it to you.
Oh, all right. I'll do that.
And
Hopefully I can do that.
if you can't for any reason, I could put it in the show notes. I could email it to Paul and he could send it out when they do the link.
Oh, I appreciate that.
That'd probably be best, wouldn't it, Paul?
I
Okay,
would love to get the recording because I've got a son that doesn't believe in anything anymore.
yeah. Well, and that's, I didn't get into that either. That's another topic I'd like to get into. I totally understand why the kids are losing faith because the narrative they're being given is so complicated and doesn't make sense. That's why I think if
Yeah.
you simplify it and make it rational, then it's more appealing.
I agree. And boy, I love this
Yeah.
because he is very intelligent and he just
Mhm.
says it's all a bunch of, crap.
Sure. Yeah, I
And-
understand that.
And this recording would be wonderful for him because
Well, I hope
all
so.
of you are so intelligent and he is super intelligent and he could gain perspective.
That's what
I
we,
hope so.
that's exactly what we try to offer. And if getting the link to join us next week with Rainbow Eagle on
Please.
the medicine wheel, be happy to have you join and have him join too. And we have a lot of interesting things coming up scheduled for the next several weeks. So he can look and choose to share whichever ones he would like.
Well, I'd like to have the copy of this recording.
Lee, what is your email address?
Lee, all lowercase, lee.lovelife.met@gmail.com.
I will see that Robert gets that for next week so that you'll be included in the email that he sends out because he sends out the links for where you can see the recordings.
Oh,
And then
good.
You'll also be put on the email list so that you will receive the weekly emails as to what the presentation is and who the presenter is.
I don't know how in the world I got on it. This is the first time I've even known anything about it.
Yeah, well, the Lord works in mysterious ways.
Oh, yes, I believe in that. Well, thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you all.
Okay, we'll let Paul sing us out. Hang on, everybody.
Okay, Paul.
Excuse me. I'd love to get on this email list too. I just found out about this after the question and answer session started. So
Okay,
Oh.
David, what's your email?
david.ag@mail.com.
Was that at just mail.com or Gmail?
Plainmail.com, no Gmail.
Okay, david.ag@mail.com.
Correct.
Okay, we'll get you on.
Thank you
there
very
as well.
much.
Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
Okay, there's a note here from Boyd saying, I guess some people got the link from Digital Legend, his publishing company that he sent out. So,
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that's where I got it from, but I didn't get it till 8 o'clock Mountain Time.
oh, okay. Well, it is recorded, so they'll send you the recording.
Awesome.
And the recordings will include the last 2 years as well that you can use if you like. But probably the more interesting thing is for you to simply join us, and that way you can get your questions and comments in as well. Well, we welcome.
Great.
Cool.
May the Lord bless you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. Good night.
Good night.